New York City. So this is my first real gig after deciding to go full time into software. So I'd done a couple sort of one-off, like friend of a friend type of thing prior to that, but this was my first real bona fide assignment for a real company with a lot of money and all that stuff. So this was a startup in Lower Manhattan that was part of an accelerator, and they had released an iPhone app. I don't know, maybe 6 months before I showed up, and the guy who wrote that app moved on to another contract. So he was a contractor too, and so that startup was left with no one to continue the development, and that's where I came in. And it was a full stack project. It was a PHP backend with an iPhone front end and a very, very simple landing page. And so I'd come on board at that point, and I was walking into a code base. That was my first real exposure to a professional code base, and it was overwhelming. I was not ready for it, and I was just overwhelmed with just the complexity and the intricacies, and I wasn't ready. It's the simplest way to put it. And it's important to note a few details. This is an on-site assignment, so every day I would go to the office, which was in an area of Manhattan called the Meatpacking District, which is about a 10-minute, 15-minute walk from where I lived. And I would show up, and I would do my hours, typically around 4 or 5 or 6 hours in the office, and those were the hours I billed for. So I didn't do any work outside the office. I did, but I'll get to that later. But all my billing hours were physically in person, and so I did that for a couple weeks. And after sort of being overloaded with the code base, I'd made the grave mistake of recommending to my client, a non-technical person, that we should do a rewrite. I should just redo the whole thing from the bottom up. And he took my recommendation on that. And so after about 2 weeks of being on the project and just sort of floundering in the code, I decided it would be easier for me to rewrite the whole thing from the bottom up, which at the time didn't seem so daunting. But I was wrong. I started rewriting the code, and after about another week or so of that, it quickly became clear that I should not have done this. There were too many edge cases, too many scenarios, too many little things that I just wasn't accounting for that the previous developer had properly accounted for. So he had properly set up for various edge cases and whatnot that I just didn't even conceive of, and they didn't become apparent to me until those edge cases manifested, and I would have to start writing all these workarounds to fix them. And turns out that previous developer had already done that, so I was just retracing his steps. So that was bad. So what I ended up doing was, after a week of that or so, every morning I would wake up, and before showing up to the office, I would do 2 or 3 hours on my own in the morning before going in that I didn't bill for. I would try to go back and rebuild on top of the code base what I had already built, on my own, and try to sort of get back to the point where we were. Basically I took 1 step forward and like 3 steps back. So I tried to get back to the point of the even point on my own in the mornings before I went to the office. The idea was to work out all these bugs and before we added new features, which is typical, by the way. So I did that for another, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks of basically billing 2-3 hours in the morning before going into the office. So I kind of dug myself a pretty deep hole there, but I was able to kind of turn it around and get back to the original code base to a point where we can start adding new features and cleaning out all the bugs that were there at first. So that was a very tough learning experience because I ended up doing a whole bunch of work that I didn't bill for, but I don't really feel bad about it because I also did bill for a lot of work that didn't help the client at all. Like it just moved things back. So it was kind of a wash from that point of view. Furthermore, the client really didn't know that was happening anyway. So it's kind of like if you don't, it doesn't hurt you if you don't know about it. That's kind of what it was like. So, now we're at a point of maybe 4 or 5 weeks into the assignment, a little bit more, maybe 6 weeks. And I finally got the code to a point where we can start adding new features. And we can start moving the code base forward instead of just cleaning out bugs now. And this is where things really start to go sideways. So my client had a list of features, as every client does, a long list of features. And it was time to start building things in. Now, the time of year is crucial here. This is around late January of 2012. And we were preparing for South by Southwest, which at that time I think was in the first week of March, the interactive portion, which is the tech portion. So we had about 5 weeks to start adding more features and creating a new release with an enhanced feature set. And my client had a list of things that he wanted to build, new features, and we were at a point now to start putting those features in. So off we go. So I started working through this feature set and adding these new features to an iPhone app. But the thing is, it was just me on the development team. There were no other developers. It was just me. So I would go into the office and I would add in a new feature. It might take me like 2 or 3 days or whatever. And then when I felt it was ready for show, I would install what's called a development build onto my client's iPhone. He would take a look at it and say, okay, looks good. Check that off the list of to-dos and on to the next feature. And if you know anything about mobile development, this is just not sufficient testing. This is not considered QA. And things that we should have done that we didn't do are test on various devices, test in various environments. So we were in an office with perfect Wi-Fi in Manhattan, test on the local 3G network, which at the time was 3G. We didn't even have Verizon phones. It was all AT&T at that point. And if you recall, well, you probably don't recall, but in New York City, the AT&T network was complete trash. So if you were working on AT&T 3G in Manhattan, you just didn't have a phone. It just didn't work. But if you're on Wi-Fi, it's an ideal environment. So things of that sort we didn't test. We didn't test how it would work in a moving situation. So maybe you're inside of a car, and how it would work if the network was spotty, or maybe you just lost connection in the middle of a download, whatever. Like, what do you do in that case? So many scenarios that have to be considered and properly accounted for in mobile development, which makes mobile much more challenging than just regular desktop, like website development, by the way, that we just didn't do. And so, we were just hammering in features, and my client would say, looks great, good job, here's the next one. And this went on for a while. This went on for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And, I got a very uneasy feeling because I was like, I knew that we weren't doing enough testing. I knew that we weren't covering for all the proper scenarios. So I just didn't really feel like it was going to be stable for at least, mass consumption. And lo and behold, sure enough, they went to South by Southwest. I stayed back in New York because I didn't want to go to Texas. And, it didn't go well. They had a presentation. They had a bunch of people download it. They reserved a whole space for this. And it was not good. It was not well received. And when everyone came back from Texas, fingers were pointed, and sort of all the shit kind of came down on me. Somebody had to take the blame for this, and as sort of the lowest man on the totem pole, that's also part of your job. And I took a major hit for this. It was not good, and it was definitely a learning experience. It was an expensive education. And Never again. Never again. So, what are my takeaways from the situation? Well, sometimes it's hard to tell without frame of reference or context, but sometimes when you're hired to do a job, you're really hired to take over the job. You're kind of hired to be the client's boss sometimes. Now, I've gotten much better at reading this situation. That's usually the case when the client is non-technical and there's no one else technical on the team. Then that's usually the case. So right now I have a couple clients, and one of them is a team in London that there's no one technical on the team. So I'm effectively in charge, even though I work for my client ostensibly. I'm in charge of this project from a technical standpoint. So I've imposed certain standards and processes that are in place. For example, there was no stand-up process. So I imposed a stand-up. Every Monday, every Tuesday, 12 noon Eastern, we do a stand-up, which is 5 p.m. London time. So it kind of fits both our timetables. I imposed that. And every day, sure enough, at 12 noon and 5 p.m. their time, I'm there. Whether or not, sometimes they miss it, but I always text them, or on the Slack chat, I say, hey guys, I'm here whenever you're ready. Sometimes they just miss it, but no matter what, I'm always there. That dovetails into my second point. Everything, about 90% of my communication now is written. So very seldom do I do a pure phone call. In fact, I almost never do that anymore. It's all on Slack, email, and if there is a voice-to-voice communication, it's going to be through Google Chat, where I can visually record the conversation. So I record all stand-ups. I record everything. There's no correspondence that takes place that I do not record. Now, I make my client aware of it. Nobody is recorded without their knowledge. But that way, there's 100% accountability. 100% accountability. So I had this conversation with my client last week where he asked me for an estimate on a new feature. This is Monday of this week, I think. And I said, probably Friday or Saturday, depending on just, how much time I have. So, today's Friday, and it's nowhere near ready because my client didn't have the specs ready, the assets. And so right away, he didn't have them ready by the next day of the phone call. So right away, I emailed him. I didn't call him. I emailed him. I said, look, when you asked me for an estimate, I provided one based on the fact that these assets would be ready by today, Tuesday, which you had told me they would be ready. They're not. So my estimates are now revised. I'm letting you know that right now. And if you put all that out there, just every day, all the time, just be very proactive with your communication, there should be full accountability. Now, if my client had called me today, Friday, said, hey, you said this would be ready by Friday, even though we had the conversation already about pushing it back, then it would just be my last day. Then today is my last day. And I said, all right, then I'm off, because there's no accountability in that situation. Now, when first starting out, back in 2012, when I was working with this first startup, I didn't have any conception of any of that. None of that stuff factored in. I was just trying to please my client and whatnot, and just sort of be a yes man. Like, I just wanted to make sure he was happy when it was all said and done. But sometimes it's not, they don't need that. They need somebody to take control. Think of it this way. Let's say I want to get in shape and I want to really get ready for the summer and all that stuff, whatever. So I hire a personal trainer. I'm paying this guy. I pay this guy to train me physically and to get ready. What is his responsibility? What if I say one day, I'm just not feeling it. I'm kind of tired. I'm just gonna drink a few beers and watch basketball instead. Would he be doing his job if he said, yeah, I'm with you on that. Have a good time. I'm going to go out and, go out with my girlfriend instead? No. That he would not be doing his job. His job would be to say, no, I'm not listening to that nonsense. You get your ass in the gym right now. Otherwise, I'm charging you double or something like that. And that would be a good personal trainer, right? Sometimes as a tech guy, you have to be that person for your client if your client doesn't have those sort of standards in place. Now, if your client obviously has certain set standards and processes in place and they work and things like that, then you get in line. And I do that a lot too, all right? And that, you have to use your discretion here. But one thing I've noticed from a lot of junior, well, it's part of why they're junior, but one thing I've noticed from a lot of sort of lesser experienced developers is they don't know when to take control of a situation. And it can be harmful if you can't read the situation properly. Now that only comes with experience. It's not something you can just sort of read in a book or from a YouTube video or whatever. But it's one thing I've gotten much, much better at recognizing when I step into a situation and figuring out when to push and when to pull. So yeah, that's what happened in my first major assignment. And like I said, it did not end pretty. Now I didn't take all the bullets. I took most of them. My client ended up taking a lot of heat himself because the startup was part of an accelerator, which means there was another company above my client who invested in my client, and the partners of the accelerator, they don't talk to me, they talk to my client, and so they say like, hey, what the hell happened there? You made us look really bad in front of a lot of people, high profile press people at South by Southwest. What the fuck? What the hell happened? And he took a lot of heat for that, most of that ended up falling on me, and so obviously that was the end of that particular situation. Luckily, that was my first. Well, nothing lucky about it, but that was my first sort of big major gig, contract, assignment, whatever. And then after that, I've had some bad situations since then, but nothing nearly that bad. That was the worst of it. I'd improved dealing with various situations since then. There are other stories that didn't end well, but nothing nearly that bad. And I'll get into some more stories, as I make more and more videos. But this was a tough lesson to learn. So if you're watching this video, and you're a new developer and you're inexperienced, I guess the main takeaway is understand when to take control of a situation and when not to. There's nothing worse than a junior dev who comes in and just like tries to like throw his weight around, like, hey, I learned this and that in my boot camp. I can't stand that. But if I had no technical chops whatsoever, if I was a non-technical founder and that's what I was looking for, then yeah, do that. Sometimes it's the proper thing to do. So like I said, know when to take control of a situation and when not to. I guess it's called finesse. You want to have some finesse. In one of my bigger contracts back in the fall, I did not take control of the situation whatsoever because it was a technical team, and they brought me on to hammer out a lot of new sort of small features and bug fixes, nothing major. But they had a whole system in place. It worked. It was good, and they didn't need me to start adding to that. And I knew that. I could see that, and so I just take a step back, fill out my Asana tickets, and just do the job. And that's it. Just do the job. But sometimes you have to push and pull. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know. It's probably hard to relate to if you don't have a broad range of experience. But it's the kind of thing that you want to learn, not through experience, if possible. So this is definitely the kind of thing you want to learn from somebody else's mistakes rather than make these mistakes on your own. And in this case, learn from my mistakes, because man, to this day, that was my worst sort of outcome in a contract. I've had some other bad ones, but this was